Hey E36 fanatics, Steven here. Today I got another really cool video for you, and this one is going to be diagnosing a head gasket leak on a BMW. This vehicle has been sitting for about 5 months. When I first started it afterwards, it had white smoke coming out of it, and it's got a long-standing coolant leak. So if you're familiar with some of the symptoms of a head gasket leak, one of the most obvious ones is white smoke coming out of the exhaust tailpipe. As you can see now, I've been driving it around and it seems like it was just condensation in the exhaust because it is not shooting out any smoke at this point. So another really obvious sign of a head gasket leak is if you've basically got exhaust bubbles or if you've got bubbles coming up from your coolant. So basically, if it's really bad, exhaust gases will come back into the coolant and a lot, and you can actually see the coolant bubbling. As you can see here, it's not bubbling. So that's another obvious thing that I'm not seeing with this, but that only happens when you have a really bad head gasket leak. Another really easy way to tell if you've got a head gasket leak on a BMW or really any other cars is to take a look at the oil. As you can see here, there's no milky substance in the oil. There's no coolant in this. And I have had a blown head gasket on a BMW where coolant was getting in the oil, and it was really obvious. Okay, so now that I've gotten out of the way the really simple symptoms to check for, if you got bubbles coming up in your coolant, if you have coolant in your oil, or if you got a ton of white smoke. And then another really common symptom of a blown head gasket is the car just runs like crap. And this one's running just fine. It's not having any issues. So I'm a little bit skeptical that I have a blown head gasket, but I am losing a lot of coolant and I have not been able to find the coolant leak anywhere. So finding coolant leaks kind of goes hand in hand. So another thing I've done is I've got a board under here, and that's basically to catch coolant to see if I've got a coolant, to see if I can basically find exactly where my coolant leak is. And actually, in fact, if you haven't seen my video on finding coolant leaks, then I'll leave a card in the top right of this video. It's a pretty good video on finding coolant leaks more generally. But now we are going to jump to a coolant pressure test. Now, this is a test I like to apply before I go ahead and apply a compression test, because if I can apply the pressure or the compression test, because if I can apply this pressure test to the coolant and I can find the coolant leak, then no head gasket issue. Now, I'm somewhat suspecting that my coolant leak is actually coming from the inside, which would be a heater core or one of the hoses going to the heater core. It's quite possible. But I'm a little bit worried about that because my floorboards don't seem very wet and I'm losing a decent amount of coolant. So what we're gonna do, I got this coolant pressure kit from Advance Auto, number 5. If you get the same kit as me, it's got a ton of different adapters. So number 5 is the right one for this vehicle. This is a BMW E36, of course. But this is going to be the same test on any BMW, really, because you're not going to have a coolant cap on the radiator. You're going to have it on the reservoir. So I'm going to pop it on here. So now I've got my pump attached to my adapter right here. I've got it tightened up. And you're going to want to pump it to between 15 and 20 psi, somewhere around there. And you're just going to let it sit and look around. And I didn't show this, but you're going to want to have your coolant. It doesn't need to be necessarily topped off, but it needs to be at least, it needs to be at the cult line or a little bit higher. You don't want your coolant to be low when you're doing this test. Okay, so I've got it pressurized at 18. Leak right here, and I swear I just heard a leak underneath. Let's see. So we're definitely leaking from the reservoir. Looks like it's leaking from the bleed screw, and it's dripping down the side of the reservoir. Now, hopefully that is my only leak. As you can see, the pressure is dropping. Now, if your pressure drops within the first 2 minutes, you know you have a leak. And as you can see here, I got a leak coming from that reservoir. All right, so it also looks like I've got a leak coming from this hose. So I can just tighten that down a bit. Okay, so once you have found the leak, hold this down and that will remove the pressure, and then you're good to go. That's it. So it's looking like this car probably does not have a head gasket leak. So I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Basically, this is the route that I try and take for head gasket leaks. I will first do the really basic stuff, and then I'll do a coolant pressure check, because if it's not blowing white smoke and it's not running like crap and you don't have water in the oil, then there's a good chance that you just have a coolant leak. So to me, it's better just to pinpoint that first and see if there is an external coolant leak before you start doing compression tests. The next step I would do, if I still didn't find the leak, is I would start really thinking it was a head gasket leak, especially if my floorboards were not soaking wet. So the next step I would do is pop the valve, pop this cover off, and pull out a spark plug and see how clean it is. Now, when you have a head gasket leak, then oftentimes the coolant will actually come in contact with the bottom of the spark plugs. When you pull them out, they'll have this white coolant film on them, or they'll be really clean, like they'll look brand new on the bottom side of it. And that'll tell you that you're getting coolant onto the spark plugs and it's mixing in. And then after that, I would do a compression test.